Bachelor and Oenology Extension Specialist with Texas A&M, Texas AgriLife Extension Services. And today I will be talking about malolactic fermentation and wine in the context of all the climatic changes that we are seeing happening. So malolactic fermentation, when we talk about fermentation in wine, we talk mainly about alcoholic fermentation. So the transformation of sugars into alcohol that changes the juice into wine. But we also have a different type of fermentation, maybe improperly named a fermentation, but still it's called malolactic fermentation. And what happens during that malolactic fermentation in wine is the conversion of malic acid to lactic acid. And the microorganisms involved in this type of fermentation are bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, specifically Enococcus eini, Lactobacillus, and Pediococcus. And through malolactic fermentation, a deacidification process happens because malic acid is transformed into lactic acid, and lactic acid is a weaker acid than malic acid. So in situations where acidity is high in a wine, and usually we see these types of situation in cool climates, so for example Canada can have high acidity issues with their wines. So if you have a wine with high acidity, you would want a process that softens that up, that decreases the acidity, increases the pH. And usually post-malolactic fermentation, we see reductions in titratable acidity of 1 to 3 grams per liter, which can be significant. It also comes with flavor modifications, so the bacteria responsible for this fermentation also generate other metabolic products such as diacetyl, which is perceived as buttery and creamy. Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that can be a detrimental thing in wine. So benefits of malolactic fermentation, as I mentioned, in the case of high acidity wines, reduction of acidity, and positive flavor changes, particularly in white wine. So we all know the buttery, creamy Chardonnays and Viogniers. That butteriness and creaminess comes from malolactic fermentation. And also microbial stability, because done pre-bottling, so if you put your wines through malolactic fermentation pre-bottling, it prevents secondary fermentation in bottle. If malolactic fermentation isn't complete pre-bottling, then there is a high chance of it happening in bottle, and with it comes carbonation, so the bacteria produces carbon dioxide, CO2, and that can create fizziness and haziness in bottle, and also build up the pressure inside the bottle, which is detrimental to wine quality. Drawbacks of malolactic fermentation, we see this butteriness. It's not always a positive thing, especially in red wines. We don't necessarily want that, or we don't want a lot of it. And what do you do when you have low acidity wines? If you have already low acid wines and you put them through malolactic fermentation, the acidity goes down even further, and that leads to the production of flat and unbalanced and high pH, increases the pH of the wine. And that, in turn, can lead to various types of spoilage, particularly in high pH wines. And you're going to hear me talk about high pH wines quite a bit today, because this is something that affects us here in Texas quite a lot. And in the context of climate change, and we see a lot of warming up of the regions of the grape growing regions in the world happening on all continents, and with that comes a decrease in acidity and an increase in pH, which can be problematic, as we will see in this presentation. So some of the influencing factors of malolactic fermentation and the quality of malolactic fermentation. One of the factors is wine pH, as I mentioned already. It has a lot of influence on malolactic fermentation. It affects the initiation and duration of malolactic fermentation. It influences the type of species of bacteria that develop in wine and that become dominant during this process. It also affects the metabolic behavior of the organisms and thus determines the kind of byproducts that are formed as a result of bacterial activity. And just to give you one short example, the higher the pH in wine, the shorter the MLF duration. There's one study that reported that a pH of 3.15, it took 23 weeks to complete malolactic fermentation, while at a pH of 3.8, it was completed in just 2 weeks. And so you can see a huge difference between 3.1 and 3.8. Now, wine pH usually ideally falls somewhere in between 3.2 and 3.6. Everything above 3.6 can be considered high pH wine. So 3.8, definitely high pH, and malolactic fermentation concludes much faster. I mentioned the different types of lactic acid bacteria that are involved in this type of fermentation. At pH below 3.5, the fermentation is dominated by Enococcus, which is what we want. At about 3.5, species of Pediococcus and Lactobacillus take over. And many of these strains, particularly Lactobacillus, are involved in wine spoilage, as we will see during this presentation. And couple that high pH with low SO2, SO2 being a preservative that winemakers add to wines routinely to maintain microbial stability, we can see a lot of spoilage causing species of lactic acid bacteria that grow and spoil the wine. So low pH has an inhibitory factor on lactic acid bacteria, and so does SO2, but you need to have the proper amount of SO2 and the proper equilibrium between the SO2 species that you have in the wine. And pH also influences the metabolic behavior of these microorganisms. So at pH of 3.5 and above, lactic acid bacteria are more likely to decompose sugars, tartaric acid, and citric acid, as opposed to malic acid, which we want. That's their whole purpose in wine. So at the pH of above that, their metabolic pathways shift, they change, and they switch to decomposing these compounds that I mentioned, which is not a good thing, because fermentation of sugar by these bacteria leads to formation of higher volatile acidity. And volatile acidity is mainly related to the presence of acetic acid in wine, and that's vinegar. So that's something that we don't want to have in our wine. So controlling wine pH is one of the keys to controlling wine spoilage by lactic acid bacteria. Sulfur dioxide, as I mentioned, preservative commonly used to control the growth of harmful unwanted microorganisms in wine. And this sulfur dioxide exists in free and bound forms in an equilibrium in the wine matrix. And this equilibrium is heavily influenced by pH. Molecular free SO2, so the molecule itself, is the most toxic form to microorganisms, so it's the most efficient one to inhibit microorganisms from being active. And this form of SO2, the molecular free SO2, increases with a decrease in pH. So the lower our pH, the higher our free SO2, molecular SO2, so the more effective it is against microorganism spoilage. So maintaining low pH in wine is helpful in making SO2 the most effective tool to control lactic acid bacteria. However, the bound form of SO2 has also been reported to have somewhat of a detrimental effect on lactic acid bacteria as well. Alcohol levels. Lactic acid bacteria can survive and grow in table wines. There is a variation between species in regards to alcohol tolerance. So Lactobacillus trichodes has been found in wine containing 20% alcohol. That's a very high percentage of alcohol for wine. So that one is alcohol resistant. And again, alcohol tolerance of bacteria excuse me, is influenced by pH as well as storage temperature. So we see this pH coming up over and over again. And as I mentioned, because of global warming, because of climate change, because of shifting of temperatures, we see a lot more grapes coming in with low acidity and high pH. And also we see wineries across the globe actually choosing not to adjust the pH of their wines. So you can adjust, you can acidify, add acid to your wines, but some wineries choose not to, especially with a natural movement and approach. So if you don't adjust your pH, you can expect to have all these problems in your wines if you put them through malolactic fermentation. This is a table that I found. It's not my table, I didn't create it. I found this table, and it talks about what can go wrong in an uncontrolled malolactic fermentation, or many times high pH wines. We will see these issues happening in high pH wines. So we see problem with viscosity, for example, ropiness and oiliness in wines. We see volatile phenol production in high pH red wines, and these phenols here make the wine smell like horse sweat and horse stable, leather, asphalt, mold, medicinal smell, and smoke, those are not desirable characteristics to have in a wine. Also in high pH wines, we see biogenic amine development, bilactic acid bacteria, and that leads to creation of histamine and tyramine, for example, and putrescine and cadaverine. So with histamine and tyramine, we have human health concerns as allergic reactions. We're all familiar with histamine. With putrescine and cadaverine, as the name suggests, we get very unpleasant organoleptic characters such as putrefaction, meaty, vinegary, and dirty aroma. Metabolism of non-fermentable sugar in dry wines. So after alcoholic fermentation completes, we see this again in high pH, particularly in reds, bilactic acid bacteria, and that leads to the production of acetic acid, as I mentioned before, so volatile acidity, vinegary smells that we don't want in our wines. Mousiness, again, we see in high pH wine under oxidative conditions, and mousiness is a wine fault that can only be perceived when the wine is tasted. It cannot be perceived when the wine is smelled, because the volatile compounds in the wine that lead to mousiness only get volatilized at higher pHs. So once you put the wine in your mouth to taste it, it reacts with the saliva, the pH shifts, and those compounds become volatile, so we can perceive them. It's a very nasty fault that cannot be fixed. There's nothing you can do to the wine, so you have to throw it out. And having high pH in your wine and putting it through malolactic fermentation many times leads to mousiness. We see masking of varietal aromas, we see glycerin decomposition, which leads to the formation of acrolein, which is bitter and also has health-related issues. As I mentioned, tartaric acid decomposition, that lowers the acidity further. Again, we see that in high pH wines, and we see formation of volatile acidity. We see color loss and cloudiness as well. And fermentation of sugars in wines with stuck alcoholic fermentation, which again can lead to an increase in volatile acidity. Some best practices that winemakers use in the winery to prevent malolactic fermentation and issues with malolactic fermentation. So using sound fruit for making the wine, sorting the fruit, eliminating unhealthy grapes, it's very important. Adding SO2, the preservative at crush, 50 to 75 parts per million based on pH. Acidifying your wines if you can, and if you are a winery that uses that practice, acidifying with either tartaric or fumaric acid. I'll be talking about fumaric acid in a minute, or any other acid to bring the pH to around 3.3 if possible. And then in the case of white wine, clarifying the must before fermentation, controlling fermentation temperature, using well-prepared pure culture starters, competitive yeast strains that produce high SO2 concentrations to inhibit the bacteria, using of antagonistic yeast strains such as Rubifirm. Yeast nutrients only if needed, because even yeast nutrients can also feed lactic acid bacteria, not just the yeast. so only if absolutely needed. And in the case of red wine, preventing must temperatures for exceeding 85 degrees Fahrenheit, puncturing the cap and keeping the cap moist. Use of lysozyme in conjunction with SO2, use of fumaric acid, pre or post fermentation or both, and checking free SO2 levels periodically and making adjustments to maintain that active level in the wine is very important. So I wanted to talk about lysozyme for a minute. It's an enzyme that is found in egg whites, has antibacterial behavior. It causes cell lysis in a number of bacterial species, including lactic acid bacteria. So it has been found to be very effective in reducing the populations of lactic acid bacteria in wine. And adding lysozyme to inhibit bacterial growth can be especially useful in wines at a high pH where SO2 will be less effective. Bacteriocins, such as peptides or proteins, you can use those. They are odorless, colorless, and non-toxic. They can be added directly in purified powder form. Nisin is such a protein, E234. Is available right now. It is lethal to many lactic acid bacteria species, but can be cost prohibitive. Fumaric acid, this is a very, very good product, and there's a lot of buzz around it right now, a lot of studies coming out showing how effective it is at both acidifying and inhibiting malolactic fermentation in wines. It is a safe agent for acidification. It is naturally produced during alcoholic fermentation, and it can completely inhibit and block lactic acid bacteria even at high levels. Sensory analysis of wines made with fumaric acid indicate positive effects after its use. It can be used in conjunction with SO2 and lysozyme. It can be unstable during fermentation, so it should be added after, ideally. And this is a study that just came out this year, fantastic study about fumaric acid and how it influences wine acidity and malolactic fermentation in wines. It's acidifying power. So if you're curious to read more about that, read that study. It's a very good one. And then there's a scorecard for determining the ease of malolactic fermentation. So all the factors that winemakers can influence to control malolactic fermentation, whether you want it or not. Each factor gets a score, and then they get added up. And usually total scores between 23 and 40 reflect difficult malolactic fermentation. So if you have high pH wines and you're trying to inhibit malolactic fermentation, aim for a total of between 23 and 40, or even higher than 40, which indicates an extremely difficult malolactic fermentation conditions. So the wine, as it is, will not undergo malolactic fermentation at a score higher than 40. So this is it for me. I'm 1 minute over my time, so thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and informative. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.